All right, welcome everyone to this very special panel discussion here. It's actually our first panel discussion in the new building here, the A-Frame Theater, which is officially even not yet open. But yeah, we started to organize a few programs here, and it's a wonderful way to get this building started and warming up for more to come. Special program, as I mentioned, it's a co-production between the History of Science Society and the Wende Museum. The History of Science Society celebrates its centennial, and you will hear more about it from Soraya in a minute. So it's part of those celebrations. It's also part of our exhibition, Counter/Surveillance Control Privacy Agency. And you might have had the chance to look around a little bit in the exhibition. If not, I would let you know that it is really worthwhile, and maybe you'll get some inspiration from our discussion today to check it out after the panel discussion. I think it's also an important topic to address nowadays. We are all living in a surveillance society, and we are all affected in many different ways. Think of CCTV cameras that are more and more connected to facial recognition technology and AI applications. Think of the digital traces we leave behind in our emails and social media that can be accessed by anyone in principle. And also think of, and this is maybe not so subtle, a reference, the possibility that through a change of political regimes, all of a sudden the kind of information you have shared and think to be completely innocent doesn't be so innocent anymore. In our exhibition, we combined historical artifacts with 16 art projects of artists who, in very critical ways and also creative ways, respond to the questions of surveillance and facial recognition. And it was important for us to emphasize the positive aspects, the agency, resilience, creativity of people dealing with these questions, and showing that this is not just something that is determining us all, but there are ways to keep ourselves free to a certain degree, I would say. I'm very honored today to have such a wonderful panel of guest speakers. I know them all to a certain extent. Sharrona, we met for the first time in person, but have been in touch for quite some time because for the preparation of your most recent book, you made use of our Bochmann collections from the border guards at Checkpoint Charlie and their facial recognition training materials. It's wonderful to get to know you now in person. Iris, we know each other even longer because we both worked at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and we're even part of the same team of teachers of world history. And then you also came to Los Angeles to do your PhD with Soraya as supervisor. And I already was a friend of yours and then became a good friend of Soraya and Michael as well. So thank you for making that connection. And Ken, we also have been in touch for quite some years. You have been in contact with the museum. I just mentioned a few years ago your participation in our panel discussion about the history of forgetting, where you played such an important role. And yeah, I'm really an admirer of your work and very happy that you are not only participating today, but also are one of our commissioned artists for the exhibition. You will talk more about it. Before we all do that, I would like to hand the mic to Soraya to say a few words about the History of Science Society and formally introduce the speakers.
And yeah, this works. Okay, I'm Soraya de Chadarevian, and I'm a professor in History of Science and Technology at UCLA. And most of you will know quite a bit about the Wende Museum, but maybe you don't know so much about the History of Science Society. So I just say a few words. The History of Science Society it claims the biggest, the largest worldwide society for the history of science, technology, and medicine. And this is to understand science and technology in the historical context and also in context, societal and cultural context. And it has over 3,000 institutional and individual members who sign up for this and help in this enterprise. Now, the society had its centennial, as you already mentioned, this year, and there were a series of events, and I think this is the last one now, and many of them, we had our centennial meeting in Latin America, in Merida, which was looking into a more international future for this society. And several events on the East Coast. This is the event on the West Coast, and we were very happy to be able to sign up with the Wende Museum, and hopefully this maybe is just one of more to come, maybe, because I think that science technology is a crucial part of many of the topics you actually, so like, can we already speak about the new exhibition or not yet?
Sure.
Which is about space, right? So science technology certainly plays an important role there, for instance. Good, and with that, I pass on to the more formal introduction of the people I also all know, more or less. So Iris is Iris Kveller, is a historian of science, medicine, and technology, who researches the history of body measuring and racialization in the 20th century, and she did her PhD at UCLA. She's currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Chicago, where she is preparing her book manuscript, The Afterlife of Skulls, How Race Science Became a Data Science. Next in line is Sharrona Pearl. She is the Andrews Endowed Chair of Interdisciplinary Studies at TCU, this is Texas Christian University, a historian and theorist of the face and body. Her most recent books, there are two, one is Mask, which came out with Bloomsbury, 2024, and Do I Know You? From Face Blindness to Super Recognition, that came out just 1 year earlier, which is quite surprising, if this continues like that. So Pearl maintains an active freelance writing practice with bylines in the Washington Post, a real-life magazine, Kveller, Lilith, and numerous other places. And finally, Ken Gonzales-Day, that maybe many of you have already encountered through his artwork in the exhibition and in earlier collaborations, or outside of the Wende, is a Los Angeles-based artist whose interdisciplinary practice considers the historical construction of race and the limits of representational systems, ranging from lynching photographs to educational museum displays. His widely exhibited Erased Lynching series, along with the publication of Lynching in the West, 1850 to 1935, transformed the understanding of racialized violence in the United States. And it's probably your most well-known work. In 2017, Ken was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in photography, and he is the Fletcher Jones Endowed Chair in Art at Scripps College. His mobile installation, as we already mentioned, Different Measures, is on view in our exhibition, and you will hear more about it in a moment. So the next stage is that every of these panelists is getting 5 minutes, not more, to say something about their work and how it links to the exhibitions and to the topic of our thing here, which is counter-surveillance, hidden histories and why they matter. And then afterwards there will be some questions from the two of us to you, and then we open it up to the public. And so, Iris, you go first.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you so much for organizing this wonderful event. I have some images for you to discuss, but we're going to go through a whirlwind of race science for the next 5 minutes. So let's see, where are we? The history of biometrics is typically told through tracing the roots of the biometric gaze to the early 19th century, especially the French system of policing from Bertillon in France in the late 1800s. Or it takes us to the 1960s and computer science departments where the early tools for identity verification are developed. However, there's an overlooked genealogy that also emerges in the late 19th century. Namely, that before biometrics was a technology of controlling human identity, it was a science aimed at understanding human racial diversity. So rather than identifying potential criminals through facial features, biometrics studied race through different skull measurements. Oh, that happened a little bit too fast. My apologies. So really, to understand facial recognition technology and the quantification of our human identity, we must trace its roots back to the skull, and we have to learn more about biometry in the age of colonial race science. So let's talk a little bit about that. The study of human variation emerged in the age of European colonial expansion and was used to justify the enslavement of indigenous people. And from the 18th century, the skull really becomes central to this race science. And it was used to compare and categorize human races, often in hierarchies that reinforced Europeans at the top. And so central to race science was the measurement of skulls. And so with calipers, the instruments that you see here, they measured various lengths and breadths between skull measurements, and this whole system of measurement became known as craniometry. And craniometry is really the foundation of facial recognition technology. And what it does is that it turns these deeply human skulls into data, which was then central to developing so-called theories of racial origins and classifications. And in the 20th century, two developments really accelerated this quantification of race science. And the first is mathematical statistics. Here we see the founder of this discipline, who you may have heard of, Carl Pearson, and he was centrally occupied with measuring skulls. And he invented several very complex statistical methods to racially classify them, several of which we still use today in other realms of science and technology. But as you can notice, he doesn't use any computers for this. It's the calculator that's central to this, and everything was done by hand. And so it was relatively limited to what he could do statistically. And so the availability of high-speed computers in the 1950s and 60s fundamentally changed this. It was now possible to process really large sets of cranial measurements and map out these complex relationships between skull measurements. And again, this is very much within the realm of race science. And it is William Howells at Harvard who largely popularizes this. And so you might be wondering, wow, we're in the second half of the 20th century, we're still measuring skulls and we're still measuring race? Absolutely. Anthropologists use these new technologies such as statistics and computers to make this research, quote, more objective. And so, what happens at the exact same time that William Howells, pardon me, is popularizing his computerized anthropology at Harvard is that across the country, a mathematician called Woody Bledsoe is developing the very first computerized facial recognition technology. And so his approach, which you can see a lot more of in the exhibit, was to convert different photos into data points that then the computer could recognize. But it's only until Bledsoe started measuring faces in this particular way, with measuring the distances between facial landmarks, that it was successful and the computer was able to recognize the faces with the photographs and the landmarks. And so biometricians today recognize this as the very first attempt at facial recognition technology. But its parallels with racialized anthropology, and especially the computerized anthropology that I just mentioned, are really striking at this time. And as it turns out, Bledsoe was very much inspired by racialized anthropology in developing this system. And so we really need this history of statistical anthropology to understand how we came from Bertillon to Bledsoe. And so to wrap this up, I want to say just a little bit more about race and facial recognition technology. And so while this was not a main concern for Bledsoe, it did end up becoming a problem. So until recently, most facial recognition algorithms were trained with largely white data sets, white male data sets specifically. And this leads to all sorts of errors. With non-white faces. It also creates problems with wrongful accusations, such as Robert Williams from Detroit, who in 2018 was accused of stealing watches through facial recognition technology, and the New York Times has a whole piece on this. But there are also some more intentional racist applications, such as in China, where we use facial recognition technology to identify and discriminate against the Uyghur minority ethnic group. And so what we can see then is that this specter of race science, which is so fundamental to developing the tools of biometrics, continues to haunt these technologies. Thank you.
So I really want to thank Iris for her wonderful talk, and I really want to thank everyone in this space. It's really a truly extraordinary exhibition. But if I can summarize some of the central things of what Iris was saying, it's that to study face recognition in the history of computing is a choice. And it's a choice that actually evacuates the broad history of racial capitalism, the long history of anthropology, the nature of art history, and all of these other components that go into the modern infrastructures of surveillance. Or to put it another way, it's always been about surveillance, right? So we can talk about all of these broad historical framings, and we can situate the roots in various different points, but to think about the history of face recognition technology only as the narrative of computing is going to evacuate all of these other stories. So one of the things that I was enormously privileged to do, if I'm talking too fast, let me know. I talk very fast and I only have 5 minutes, is to actually work in this wonderful archive during the pandemic where the archivists actually scanned so much of this material for me. And just huge shout out to archivists for anybody who does historical research. Amazing. And I was able to look at the most surveilled border of its time, which is Checkpoint Charlie. And it was the border between East and West. It was the most surveilled of its time because it was the point at which there was the greatest traffic, because everybody could pass across it, including soldiers from the Allies. And here in this space are the papers of the head border guard, Peter Bachmann, who was one of the many people who invented facial recognition testing, just as much as prosopagnosia or face-blind researchers in the historical record. So he invented or developed his system in deep consonance with trends that were happening across the world around surveillance. So he was not operating in a vacuum, but he was extremely irritated that this border was so porous. So people snuck across all the time. And how do you imagine they snuck across this border? With, what do you think? Right, forged passports, stolen documents, right? So he wanted to teach his guards how to be better at detecting fraudulent or stolen passports. So he essentially tried to train the guards in how to detect faces and match them to images. By the way, most people who do this, including people who work for the TSA, are okay at it. So they're about as good as the rest of us at matching faces to people, which is about 70 to 80%, which means that they get about 20 to 30% wrong. I'm just going to leave that out there. So we heard a bit of the greatest hits of biometrics. I call them the biometrics guys. I tried to trademark it. Nobody wanted to. But people tell this story in very, very broad sweeps, from Lavater, Gall, Spartzheim, all of these people who do exactly the kind of work that Iris excavated so beautifully around trying to identify people based on their physical bodies. But there's a huge gap in the historical story. You often hear about Galton, right, who is the guy who invented or used statistics, social Darwinism, eugenics, to Nazis, to face recognition, right? This is how we tell the story, but there's actually a lot of important innovations in between that show that this was an imperfect system, right? i.e. a perfect system that could be improved. And one of the reasons that I always insist that we look at the histories of technology and their development is because their roots are built into the system. Their point is built into the system. Technology is not neutral, and face recognition technology, biometrics, surveillance were all designed to mark the passage of people from one point to another and determine who's allowed to and who's not, which has massive both implications and roots in race, in who we think of as valuable people, and who we allow free passage from point A to point B. So here is a very, very broad scope of some of these histories, and now we see today face recognition technology is ubiquitous. How many of you have phones that you unlock by looking at your face? That's the easiest version of it because it's trying to match you to you, but as Iris pointed out, if you're trying to match you to a starting set of, say, Fortune 500 CEOs, so it's going to be a lot of white men, then any single non-white person is going to be a match, leading to a lot of false positives. Now, really quickly, I just want to sort of provide a proof text for my point that a lot of these technologies are being repeated in consonance with other spaces, which is something that this exhibit so beautifully elucidates. So up here, we have an image of from Bachman's personal archive trying to train border guards how to kind of track, are these people the same? And at the bottom, we have an example of test items from the Glasgow face matching test from 2013, trying to determine if these are the same people. So we think a lot about scientific innovation. These images are separated by 50 years. A lot of these technologies are repeating themselves, once again, to determine who is allowed to move freely and who is not. Another version of this, and this is just for fun for all of you, is the Before We Were Famous test. It's another test of face recognition technology. Who's number one? George Clooney. Number two? Oprah Winfrey, who has a lot to answer for right now. Number three? Right, and is this going to tell us something about the nature of this crowd? What you know, what you don't? Number four, Vince Vaughn. Where are my Canadians? Thank you. Harrison Ford. Michael J. Fox, another one of my country's national treasures, and Bruce Willis. So this is the other side of the face recognition testing, and I bring this to you for two reasons. Number one, because it's fun, and number two, because this is a test that they give people to see if they're super recognizers, and it's a great example about how culture is embedded into science, because you can be really bad at this, not because you're not a super recognizer, but because you don't happen to know who Avril Lavigne is. So I'm just going to conclude with a quick methodological note, because part of what I am doing here, what this exhibit is doing, is trying to excavate hidden links in the chain of development, right? Both by saying that there are multiple origin stories and histories to the story of surveillance and counter-surveillance, by looking at it not just as the history of computing, but the history of anthropology, the history of biomethics, but also to say, what are the stakes for excavating doing bad better? Right? Do we need to, as historians, sit with the ethical implications of bringing forth a system that actually could be a more effective way of repressing people? Is that a problem? What if Peter Bachman had the clue to actually limiting the free movement of people across spaces, right? The Stasi is one of the most repressive regimes in the history of the world. And here we are trying to bring forward what could be a really effective way to stop people from moving freely. Now, as an aside, his training was probably about as effective as trying to teach people who are colorblind to concentrate really hard and see the color red. Like, it's just not going to work that well beyond telling people to pay a little more attention, which is effective. But what if it were to work? Is this something that we have to wrestle with? And I want to say really, really strongly, because we are in a really, really tense moment around the value of the humanities. We're in a very anti-intellectual moment. And we're also in a place where historians are wrestling in quite public and sometimes embarrassing ways with this specter of presentism, right? Using history to kind of debate and weigh in on the kind of issues in the present. And I want to say in the strongest possible terms that I actually think that makes it more vital than ever to excavate these hidden histories and hidden stories, even if they might actually give us the clue to doing bad things better. Because if we only tell the stories that are the official versions, or if it is only up to the judgments of any given individual whether a particular history is going to be dangerous or not, then we are only reproducing the stories that those in power want us to know. So I again want to end by saying that excavating Peter Bachmann's archive, excavating these versions of surveillance that might themselves have been incredibly effective, is also a form of resistance. Thank you.
How is everybody? Good? Enough rest? So I just have one slide. 5 minutes. I didn't want to try to overdo it. So if you haven't seen the show yet, I have a piece in the show. It's a mobile, and it's hanging over your head. And this is I just figured I would walk you through the pieces, and then there'll be time to talk about more specifically, I guess, afterwards. Each image has a front and back, and each is from a sculpture that's in a museum collection that I photographed in person. So it's not a Google search downloaded. I went in person to find these objects. Each of these objects is from the history you've just heard summarized at a different point in it. So there's no pointer here, but this one is Lombroso. Lombroso basically studied the skulls and bodies of criminals after they died or were executed, and used parts of them to create basically representations. So I went and photographed the actual object and have presented it here. Over each image, there's an overlay of the measuring system that was used, referencing back to the origins of all the systems you've sort of heard described. So that's basically 19th century. This is from the Museum of Natural History in Paris. Basically was the Trocadero Museum and was part of the World's Fair 1890 and beyond. And without going into all the details of whether, I guess, the specifics of those communities that are represented, the next one was from the 1915-16 California-Panama exhibition, which was to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal. Prior to that moment, race was understood as cultural difference. There was not yet a racial hierarchy in the way that we think of modern racial hierarchies. So for me, it was important to identify the beginnings and also to identify the role of artists in contributing to bad science. So I'm here to acknowledge that history and to try to create an artwork that would then take that history and allow the same kind of agency and criticality that we've heard that the exhibition is doing overall, so that a person could look, and there's a catalog for the exhibition which has essay that I wrote on many of the pieces. So you could find out the specifics of these pieces there. And I wanted to read bits of it, but I'm not going to, because it would take too long. But I worked really hard on it. I'm pretty proud about it. So anyway, the one next to it, Malvina Hoffman was the most famous sculptor in her day in 1930, received the largest commission ever of any woman, $300,000, to sculpt the 104 races of the world. Yeah. After, by the Field Museum. So basically, we see from the 1915-16 San Diego exhibition that by 1930, Henry Field had seen that exhibition and commissions Malvina to really construct this idea of race. They continue, the Field Museum basically advises her, and they continue to identify races, getting as far as 146 races at some point. Then this thing called the Second World War comes along, and the Holocaust, and people begin to rethink their investment in racial difference, and we see a reduction in racial categories. So each of these objects has a role to play. The one next to it, you can't see the graphic, but you'll have to look more closely when you get there. But it has the sort of a diamond pattern from facial recognition technology, and this would a young boy from the White Nile region in northern Africa from the Trocadero Museum, 19th century. Generally speaking, the study of these busts were around racial categories that existed, and so for the majority of these 19th century thinkers, they didn't like racial mixing. So Latinos are often not included because we represent multiple racial strains. So it's very hard to find a Mexican in one of these museum collections, and so that's been part of my project. So here are some indigenous Mexican casts that were made in the 19th century. Robespierre is the next one, basically here. And Robespierre, the cast was made by Madame Tussaud after he was decapitated in the Place de la Concorde. And the mold was copied many, many times and distributed widely. basically, I have an overlay from a line drawing that was done with a physiotrace machine when he was a young man, and overlaid it on the mask to identify that, to prove that it's actually his face, which has been a debate for some scholars for since he died, basically. Next to that is the idea of sort of whiteness, and this was a Scandinavian servant, and so basically they're trying to track all the different kinds of race, including whiteness. The next one's a phrenological head, which basically is bad science, but they continue to be popular, and were popular at the time in all kinds of weird ways, and you live parts of that legacy when phrases like "birds of a feather flock together." It has to do with that idea that there's that there are types and that there's universals. So that. What's that? Hybrid culture. Yeah, thank you. And then also from the Trocadero, a man of Chinese descent. Then next to that, so those are all basically objects that were used to study and create categories within the field of science, and then were used also to teach how to depict racial difference in art schools. So the two things kind of come together. The last grouping are two that were photographed in relationship to the Wende. So the Lenin sculpture you probably can imagine is from the collection here. They have over 140, I believe. Yeah, so I photographed a great many of them and wanted to include something reflecting their collection. The Harwood bust, the African man or a person of African descent may have been a slave. 1758 is the earliest representation of a person of African descent that they believe to be a real person, as opposed to typology. And again, overlaid with a measuring system. And then the last one is a Aztec figure of a sacrificial figure that would have been draped in human skin in the ancient world, and it was a way of me trying to insert a contemporary presence. So the way that as a Mexican American, brown people and black people are overly identified or misidentified with AI and facial recognition technology. So I wanted to bring that in, and that figure is then wearing all of the different systems from the 18th, 19th century. And again, you'll have to go out there and look at it closely, but it's basically a fine line pattern that I tried to create like almost like it was a tattoo or a sort of a visual element. So rather than just having it on top, I was trying to incorporate it into it. And I think it feels like my 5 minutes already. You know, so, all right, thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for these very lively and full of information and ideas presentation. It's really fantastic to hear. Maybe let me start with a question about the fact that facial recognition technology is received or interpreted by some people as a positive thing because they argue it makes it easier to catch criminals, it makes our lives safer, etc. How would you respond to that argument, and what would you say are the main threats, generally speaking, developed through this new development of facial recognition technology?
Was that for anybody?
Yeah, for anybody.
Everybody's looking at me. Basically, we're talking beforehand that there's a lot of studies that have looked at the disproportionate misrecognition of people of color, and so that was sort of my entry point for the exhibition, and also for thinking about today, and trying to create an artwork that would allow us to think about how those representations are processed. So, as artists use faces, and now, of course, in photography, people are making up artificial faces, AI faces. So I was just thinking about all of the ways that the human face has been used in the fine arts to represent notions of truth, and trying to open that up with that last figure to get something more open-ended, I guess. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so to amplify that, of course, so many of these technologies are practiced on the most vulnerable communities amongst us, right, historically. But I will say that they've gotten a lot more effective at eliminating false positives, partly to do with a technology company called Clearview AI and a number of other reasons. The number of false positives, i.e. matches that are fake that disproportionately affect particularly men of color, has decreased dramatically. So many advocates of these technologies say, all right, well, we've eliminated the error and thus we no longer have to be concerned. And I would say we have to be even more concerned than ever. So the discourse is one of privacy versus security, wherein we imagine that the security is so effective that it trumps all concerns about privacy. Number one, that is not true necessarily. And number two, I would say the question then becomes, who exactly are we protecting ourselves against? So in order for us to imagine that this privacy versus security trade-off is a good bet, we have to have a lot of faith in those who are adjudicating and making the decisions. And my argument would be that we do not have a system of equity wherein we can say that those that we are deciding are the ones who are the criminals, who are those that we are persecuting, are so unequivocally problematic such that we can then employ these technologies to hunt them down. So my response would be, there's a lot of systems that we have to fix before we ought to be introducing technologies to even more effectively hunt down the people that tend to be, once again, our most vulnerable and minoritized.
Just to add to these brilliant comments, I think a lot of industry terms or terminology that floats around is like, oh, we'll work on the tech fixes, right? And we'll eliminate the technical problems, and then we can move forward and things will be more accurate in the future. Whereas I think what is really important to these hidden histories is that when we look under the hood, we can see how problematic and how difficult and how deep-rooted and scattered these issues actually are. This is not just a single tech fix in one algorithm. The problem is distributed across various databases, various methods, various statistical programs and software. And so we need this interdisciplinary, deep historical look to figure out where are these collections coming from, where's the data coming from, what is built into the machine, and how is it affecting the operations of the machine. So that's kind of on the input side of things. And on the output side of things, I think, yeah, very much kind of amplifying what has been said is just let's not focus just merely on making things more accurate. We need to think about at what cost and to whose benefit, right? I think one of the things that's becoming more and more evident is that in our AI landscape, this is having a huge environmental impact, and we should take those things into consideration in addition to who is harming from all these technologies, as we've already discussed.
Quickly to that point, Google is already operating small nuclear power stations just for this purpose, just for generating AI applications.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking, I don't know, when you are going to Lux now, they say you don't need a passport anymore. And, you know, you can just do it with face recognition. And I always feel we are feeding, you know, we are training the systems. And I don't know how to actually, if any of these resistance people can tell me how I can resist that system. Because I really feel I help the system develop, right? And it's not something to celebrate. I much prefer to show my passport instead of having, you know, feeding data to this system.
Although your passport's also a form of surveillance.
Yeah,
technology.
I know. It has a chip in it. Okay. But I have a question. Maybe we have already talked a little bit about this, but the three of you actually, all three work very historically. Also, you know, Ken, which is, you know, interesting as for an artist working so deeply historically, and I mean, who listens to these stories? I mean, how do we make them matter, right? And I know you have something to say about this because you tried. Maybe, you know, and also maybe what can historians and artists help in sort of, you know, getting the message out, and then also what impact does it have?
I'll try to be extremely brief about this. I think there's two audiences that I talk to. First of all, a very broad category of scientists who I try to have listen to me. They typically are quite interested in the history of their own discipline. And so you kind of come in, and so, you know, it's not this much of an internalist conversation where, for instance, forensic anthropology didn't just show up in American universities in the 1970s. It has this much longer history that is embedded in colonialist race science. And so there's a conversation that you can start where I do quite a bit of research and interdisciplinary conversations with forensic anthropologists on particular software that they use that uses all old cranial collections from the 19th century that are deeply racialized, and they use that to help identify missing human remains, which is kind of coming back to that previous question. It's a good mission. You want to identify victims of all sorts of crimes, but the program does this in a deeply racializing way. And so helping the discipline kind of grapple with those questions and what history can offer in that respect. Not everyone is interested in that story, but those who are already quite critical of these practices are very, feel like the histories that I offer are incredibly helpful for them to show why it is racializing, how that exactly happens, by showing these minute links between the past and the present in the operations of the software. So for instance, one of the things that's really important here is that have many of you heard of Sarah Baartman, or the Hottentot Venus? I think many of you have heard of this person who was deeply racialized and turned into a scientific specimen throughout and after her life course. And so her remains have been repatriated back to South Africa, but her data lives on in this specific database. And her measurements, biometric measurements, live on in the Harvard archives. And so part of the intervention there is showing, hey, to the archivist, this material is here. I don't think it should be here. This needs to be classified and put away. The other area that I think you're pointing towards is the tech industry, which I've had a few conversations now with some tech leaders who are not interested in this message of to whose benefit and at what cost. They truly believe that we're entering a whole new era with AI. This is the last generation that gets to decide how we have a relationship to computers. And so they want advice on how to navigate that transition in human experience. And that is a world where I'm not quite sure how to manage that or how to interrogate that. I think all of these technologies need a lot of human intervention to function at all. And also, who are the ghost workers who run the AI? It's underpaid laborers in India and other spaces who actually do the work. So it's a kind of a matter of who's willing to have these conversations and how do you break into those different industries, essentially.
Thank you. It's amazing, right? What a group. I guess I was just thinking, as you guys were speaking, well, the one thing is that I've read is that it's not regulated, right? So there's no regulation when we pick up our phone. There's no standards that are being established. We don't know what the phone is doing exactly or who's doing it. So that's part of it. And then the other thing I was thinking of was part of this, for me, was going back and looking at the different ways that the face was visualized. So for Malvina Hoffman, she used the ear as a measuring point. And of course, Leonardo had like a square that went top and bottom. So I had each of the different systems and looked for the representation that it produced to see how that skewed, right, through the artist's hand. So how Leonardo's representations are transformed by the system that he uses and how that informs our own expectations of the artwork. So I was trying to get back at that idea of representation. And one of the challenges for my students, of course, is when they're creating AI images, it's pulling from all of the other artists that already made work, right? So there's a lack of, again, of credit, I suppose. And that's a challenge. If we get rid of all the living artists and we just have AI, what's going to happen? So I think the idea, for me, the role that the artist still has a role to play, and that role is still, as it was in the 19th century, essential to helping us begin to decouple these systems, right, the knowledge base, and to find a way to connect it to the humans that are interacting with it. Which is why I put the mobile over your head, so it's like it's your imaginary. It's all the things that are in our culture.
So something that you both gestured towards is the importance of, STS, Science Technology Studies, speak of unblack boxing these kinds of technologies, or excavating what's actually happening and kind of understanding. Not that we all need to become experts in face recognition technology, but removing some of the magic or some of the enchantment from these processes, in which we will then discover that people are really still very, very necessary. And the thing we should not be fearing is that the computers are going to take over, right? That's actually not the real fear. And there are a lot of things to be scared about, but that's not one of them. Having said that, I think we're all suffering from tremendous fatigue right now about all the things that are catastrophic that we have to worry about. So, like, if I'm being really honest, Soraya, the answer to your question is, I don't know. How are we supposed to get people to care about this when there's so many other things that we have to care about immediately? And I'll say that when I talk to people, I spend a decent amount of time talking about this stuff, people are both simultaneously, as you might all be, terrified out of their minds and completely okay. Right? Like, on the one hand, this stuff is really invasive. It's really oppressive. It is really differentially oppressive. It also has tremendous environmental stakes. On the other hand, like, yeah, I want to get across the border. I want to open my phone. I want to function in this world. And I think that there's a lot of just market transactions that people happen. So my solution is actually to amplify, or my answer would be both to remove the enchantment from the technology and try to understand what it is and isn't doing and what the capabilities actually are and aren't. So Lee Vinsel talks about tech hype. He's a scholar who talks about, let's not get too carried away with these technologies. And also amplifying the voice of wonderful and incredibly thoughtful journalists like Kashmir Hill, who has done really remarkable work in this sphere, because people are definitely listening to her more than they're listening to me.
Thank you. I was thinking of a question about the transition from analog to digital surveillance technologies, but I actually wanted to make it a little bit broader. Would you say that the impetus to categorize people and faces and use those categorizations in a normative way is something that is characteristics of humans in general, or maybe even some animals, and that what changes is just the technology to make it more effective?
Well, I think the face is such a profound part of how we create intimacy and build relationships and make sense of one another. And we've just lived through a 4-year experiment in what happens when we remove unfettered access to the face. And it was really, really hard, right? To have people's faces obscured in part, to struggle with what constitutes being intimate with somebody. Is it when you're face-to-face with them but mediated by a screen, or when you're co-located but you don't have full access to the face? So I don't want to minimize the power of, that what Emmanuel Levinas calls that face-to-face moment and the origin of ethics, wherein you look at somebody and you encounter their humanity. It's a very human impulse to want to see the face, but then to go from there and that kind of individual moment to the aggregate of this is what these kinds of people are like, right? And actually trace that a little bit in one of my books, the kind of move to broadly characterize large swaths of people. That's the moment where we have to pause and think about what are the losses in imagining that we can eliminate individual distinction through these broad categorizations. What are the losses, and then what are the fundamental goals in trying to say, that's what these kinds of people are like? And I think that's where we have to pause and actually think about, instead of that being a function of humanity, how that undermines our humanity.
I'm just thinking a lot about how throughout all of this work, there's such a profound interplay between the individual and the larger population. And so I think when I think about this long history of biometrics, I think there's a huge conflation between both identification and classification. The one does not function without the other. So we might think that surveillance is really about the individual, about you. Who are you? Can we verify that you are the same person as you are on your passport, as you are in that chip? And so that whole technology does not work without classification. It needs to be run against larger databases that are organized in certain ways along certain typologies. And so I think there might be some sort of larger I'm not sure if I'm comfortable speaking about human experience as a broad category, but definitely a larger scientific history involved in just making meaning, creating order out of complexity, right? That's the whole point of 18th century natural history. We encounter so much complexity in nature, and we try to get a grip of it through laws and regulations. And the same thing happens with humans as well, and that's where definitely the racial program comes in. And so to the second part of your point where you say, it's just improving accuracy or getting just smarter with the different technologies. And I think to some extent that is correct. I also think when I look at all these different opportunities and different technologies that interact with the face or with the skull, I just see a lot of early 19th century race science. It's a lot of very simple medical, we take the head, here is the eyes, where are the different points, and how do we analyze it? And whether it's a human who's reading that or a computer who's reading that, it's the basic same structure at its core. So I don't know, there's these very long parallels that we can draw, I think.
Ask one more, or shall we open it? Okay, one more, and then you have a chance. You can already start thinking about your questions. So, and this again comes from something you just said, or it was mentioned before, about what really happens when the computer comes in, or artificial intelligence come in. Because on the one hand, we trace these long histories, and we say it's more of the same, right? But then what happens, and not just in the quantity, but maybe in the qualitative change, when the computers come in, and the algorithms and AI.
Sure. I'm happy to try to take that one on. So one of the things that one of my students is doing this semester, basically created like a dating app, a gay dating app that was meant to reference the real world, his experience as a young man dealing with identity at this moment. And in doing it, he tried to create one in which you fail, basically. So all of the times you begin to articulate your desire, where you run up against this wall. So I think what that says is that that for young people, their expectations of pleasure are being narrowed in a way that will exclude many of us from the equation. You know what I mean? Because they're interacting with the technology in a way that is satisfying and is symmetrical and is aesthetic to them in a way that devalues the rest of us. So for that student, aging was a big no-no, right? Or they had all these different sort of things where his algorithm began to reveal. And he was trying to make a system that was critical of his own generation, not simply echoing it. So he was trying to bring an awareness to his fellow students. And I think that was what was interesting, is like the lens of technology has altered the ability to perceive the world. So they literally don't perceive the same world we do, right? Generationally, it's a different world. So I think that's a place where representation can begin to offer alternatives or offer ways of slowing people down to rethink their relationship to those objects.
It's quite a subversive question in its way, Soraya, because you're sort of asking, is this historical orthodoxy that everything is a continuity actually wrong? Is this actually different, not just in degree, but in kind? Are we actually in the brave new world now? I'm definitely not going to answer that right now, by the way. But I will say to a certain extent that the intervention I can offer is a repetition of what I said before, which is that we have to understand what these things can and cannot do. Which is to say that we're never going to wholly eliminate people. And in that sense, there are very strong continuities, right? We always need the people to frame these programs and create these programs in particular kinds of ways. And again, that doesn't answer the question, but I will say that it might create the framework for interruption. And another framework for interruption also harkens back to something that you said, that even all of these very clever assignments that professors give students to use the AI to answer the question and then analyze the thing is actually training the AI, right? We are doing labor. We are putting our students to work to train these systems. So I think awareness, once again, of what they can and cannot do might actually cause us to pause and think about what we are doing for them.
I'll just briefly say, I think it's always interesting, and several of you may know this in the audience, that the term computer used to signify female technicians operating the calculators. I had a really beautiful photo that I ended up cutting out of slides to stay within the 5 minutes. And so the computer used to be a human, and then it became this black box that we have no idea what happens on the inside. And so I'll just say, kind of echoing what has been said before, is that I think it's just a shifting human-machine relationship that happens throughout time. And so is it something fundamentally new? I'm also not going to be able to answer that question just quite yet, but I do think it shifts responsibilities in a way that becomes harder to track. And so who's doing the actual thing? Is it the anthropologist, in my case, picking up a skull and looking at it? Or is it the computer that's getting a lot of data input and then plopping out a racial classification? So who's to, quote unquote, who's responsible for all of this? And I think that's the difference. I do think, and I'm not quite sure yet how to fully understand this, I do think we're entering into some sort of new stage with AI. I do think that there's something happening. There was a great piece or collection of essays in Osiris, which is one of the journals of the History of Science Society, that actually does argue for that. But I have to sit with that a little bit longer.
Okay, thank you very much. And with that, we open it up for the Q&A. I see there are already a lot of questions. My colleague Jean walks around with a microphone. When you get the microphone, I want to ask you, when you ask your question, wait for the microphone. Also, keep it short and concise and one question at a time. So we'll start here. Yeah.
Thank you. Following on a discussion Soraya and I had earlier today, I'm Christine Borgman, UCLA, and I'm on the board of directors of the Electronic Privacy Information Center in Washington, D.C., which has not been mentioned. And for 30 years, we have been filing lawsuits, amicus briefs, Freedom of Information Act, because there is almost no legal protection in the United States against these technologies. And EPIC is already bracing. We've had a strategy meeting because we expect this to be a very surveillance-forward administration coming up. I mean, we got some progress in Biden administration. We are not expecting it here. So my question back to you as historians is to think about who watches the watchers, and what kind of legal and what kind of things can we pull together as a community, because we do have lawyers working to help us on this. And help us think about who watches the watchers here, please.
Yes, thank you for that. And it's also interesting to note that different states have different spaces for this. So Illinois, surprisingly perhaps to some, has the most robust protections for people around privacy on the internet, followed by California. So Facebook and Clearview very quickly got everything out of Illinois because that was the site of most of the law cases. Thank you for bringing that up, because the wonderful organization, also the Library Association, has one of the longest standing both databases, reference points, and robust advocacy for privacy, because they actually were the spaces where knowledge actually emerged. So I would just amplify what you were saying and also say that we should know who our allies are, right? So connecting with places like the Library Association that actually has on their website all of the protections for individual privacy, because frankly, they have been protecting the circulation of knowledge in the United States since 1865. On a state-by-state basis. But you can go to your local library website and learn a lot more about how to protect your own privacy.
I wondered what happened, Iris, to the man who was falsely accused, the African-American, but tied in with that, I've heard that facial recognition is not as effective for African-Americans as whites. And I wondered, what is that? What makes that so?
So I can say that the civil rights lawsuit was concluded this summer, and so he's been acquitted. And also the city of Detroit is no longer allowed to use facial recognition technology without all sorts of extra investigation material to put someone up for an investigation, essentially. So this was a huge case, and I think hopefully the rest of the country is paying attention to this and how this needs to be managed. And I'm not entirely sure as to the second part of your question. Part of that is, I think, how are we training the databases that feed into these algorithms? And as we have mentioned earlier, I think part of the problem is that these databases are often incredibly white. And so there has been a long-standing call for diversifying these databases. Joy Buolamwini, a book of hers is at the front if you want to check it out, was kind of instrumental in starting this conversation and making these databases more diverse. But I will say this I also see as a tech fix. It's nice to diversify databases, but I think there are much larger questions that we need to ask about. Why do we have these databases? Who is being surveilled? Why? And why do these things continue to racialize in the way that they do? So that's good. I think it's a good effort to do that, but I think that there are larger societal issues at play that deserve interdisciplinary conversations such as these.
Yeah, go to the second row.
Thank you. I think it's a little bit outside of the topic, but I still am very interested. If we go into the field, just no political, no racial, just in the field of identification, verification, and so on. So from my working days, I remember the genotyping, DNA methods would take 1 day or something like this at the least, in order to really precisely, with no faults, no false results, could show you who the person is. How is the state of the art now? How close is genotyping really for identifying each person and then going to passports, to criminals, and so on?
Yes, incredibly close, enormously effective, and at the moment, for example, it is currently still illegal in the United States to take your genetic data and use it to discriminate against you for things like health insurance. I do not imagine that illegality is going to sustain going forward. So once again, there are very serious concerns about privacy as we participate in these modes of individual identification.
Maybe, can I don't know, this article I know about this and read with my students is a bit older, but as far as I understand, it's still true that when you do genetic identification, you have to identify, in contrast to when you do fingerprinting, you have to compare it to a comparison population. And so that's where the problems come in, because you have to make decisions to what population you compare it. And so I think it's still true in the courts that you can't use just genetic information. It's just a point of evidence. You combine it with other kinds of evidence. I think we're still there. Yes. And if this will change fundamentally, I don't know.
No, I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, and so just to add to that, I don't think that there is some sort of vacuum space in which these sciences exist, because if you think about which populations they're compared against, these are choices and decisions being made, as you point out, but there's also an availability of data that this is compared against, right? And that is the availability of where did they do this research, who went into this research, what was left out. There's all sorts of human fingerprints all over this work that makes it hard to kind of separate the science out of society fully to the extent that we might want to.
There's a question in the third row over there.
You say that the surveillance was basically built on white males. I'm wondering if there's any difference or discrimination against females.
Yes. So, let me just clarify. There are multiple different origin stories for the history of face recognition and surveillance. The original starting databases by which the modern versions of face recognition technology that we employ were trained on white men. But I will say that the difference from, again, depending on when your origin point is, 1956, 1975, 2001, 2019, when the Amazon recognition with a K software misidentified 20 members of Congress because they were people of color and women, to now is staggering, because It's only quite recently, due to things like Facebook tagging and this system called Clearview AI that scrapes the faces in our database, where the database went from something like 400 white men to 2,000 people to now over 9 billion faces. A lot of those biases have been eliminated. That is the tech fix, and it has largely occurred. And in many ways, that makes this even more pervasive and concerning. The more effective it is, the better it is going to be at determine who gets to move where and when. And that lies entirely in the hands of people who control these systems. Sometimes they might be good. Sometimes they might not.
Okay, yeah. First row. No, I think.
So this kind of goes back to the watch the watchers idea.
Yes.
One of the things that concerns me, I take a sort of long view over this, having been trained as an anthropologist, is that improvements in, we'll call it technology, for want of a better term, have accelerated over the last 10,000 years. We started with the agricultural revolution, there was an adjustment to that, and we wound up with cities, not perfectly organized. Now the technological improvements, if you want to call them that, are happening more rapidly so that we don't have time to consider what the consequences are. So I guess my question really is, how do we, going back to the watch the watchers idea, how do we control who uses this technology, how they access it, what they do with it, and not just in a state-by-state arrangement or even a country-by-country arrangement, but do we go to the UN? I mean, how is that done? Because the consequences are going to be enormous for movements of population, movements of individuals, and that's basically the question. Who do we approach as people concerned for our future as people to regulate this in a way that doesn't damage us?
I would just say the thing I noticed these days is that the students are primarily engaging with social media more than anything else. So there's no way to put that back in the genie back in the bottle unless you take their phones away, and that's not going to happen. And there's so much learning that's happening in that space that we really would need a different paradigm to think about it differently. And to regulate it, I suppose they can track everything at some point. So
Interestingly, my godson is 23, and he and I have specifically discussed his relationship to AI and does it worry him? And it turns out, I mean, I wouldn't have expected this answer, but what he said to me was, I'm frightened. And he's the future. He's 23.
As we are recording this, I want to ask everyone only to speak in the microphone.
Sorry. I love the question because it indicates a lack of passivity, right? There actually is the possibility for us to actually be thoughtful about how we engage and what the future looks like, both in the long term and in the aggregate. And there are some very urgent and specific questions getting back to the legal framework. Is your password on your iPhone a key? Or is it a password, right? If it's a key, then it can be compelled. If it's a password, it's protected speech. The law is lagging behind the technology. Many of you know a lot more about this than I do, but there are a lot of spaces in which we can meaningfully think about how to intervene and not just always be reactionary. And I think we tend to adopt this kind of passive, it's bad, and what are we going to do? So I think I see your question as an invitation.
If I can just say, I think it's good to know that the young people are concerned, right? So there is some hope, I think. They will do something about it, maybe.
I couldn't give him an answer.
Yeah, but they will figure it out.
Any other questions? Yeah,
yes.
Over there in the back. Yeah. No, it's okay. It's okay. Yes. Oh.
So I'm a retired reference librarian, and I'd like to disillusion you about librarians for a minute.
No, don't. Please don't.
The ALA has been fairly admirable in terms of protecting libraries' own patron records. But when libraries use online services like Libby or Hoopla, those companies log everything that you do, and then they use if you're reading ebooks on your Kindle, Amazon is tracking everything you read and sharing that data with absolutely anyone they want to. And the same holds for surveillance technologies in general, I think, and this is an area of both hope and fear for me, that whether it's fingerprints or facial recognition or DNA or retinal scans, police departments and the TSA and the security at the mall or whoever are not running that stuff in-house. It's going to corporations like Clearview or Amazon Web Services or Motorola or Axon, and then they will then share it with absolutely anyone they want to, which includes police in Arizona and Texas, so they can arrest people who come to California for abortions or for gender-affirming care, or who are just political dissidents. The good news, I think, is that we can resist this at the local level. 2 weeks ago, the Culver City Council voted on their legislative agenda for the next 4 years, and it included lobbying for responsible regulation, but not a ban on facial recognition by police. So the people who voted for that are Dan O'Brien, Jorn Eriksson, and Albert Vera. People of Culver City voted for those people. We can vote for some different people next time. It comes down to the 28,000 registered voters of Culver City that Culver City can ban the use of facial recognition by Culver City Police, and that's a start. So I'm sorry, that's not really a question.
No, but thank you for the comment, and maybe someone wants to...
Well, I'll just say I find this fascinating. So there are a few cities in the United States that have banned the use of facial recognition entirely. There are ones you could probably guess: Oakland, California, Somerville, Massachusetts, what they might have in common, and so on. And one thing that I find quite fascinating, that in distinction to, for example, the United Kingdom and London, which until recently had 50% of the world's closed-circuit television cameras and was by far the most surveilled city in the world. Now, of course, China is competing very aggressively for that title, is that in the UK, while there has been a huge amount of resistance to this, there's a lot more trust in government institutions, whereas in the United States, there's a lot of resistance to the government having access to these technologies, but a wholehearted and full-throated embrace of the use of these technologies by private companies. So if anybody thinks that Ring is making their money selling doorbells, I have a bridge to sell you. That in the United States, there is just a significant buy-in to use of these technologies for the purposes of making money. So I think that national character comes into play in really interesting ways, and deeply local character comes to play in interesting ways, and the way that people feel invaded is very different in different places.
Thank you for that. Two final questions. We have one question of the gentleman who gave away the phone, the mic. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Hi, thank you, wonderful panel. Maybe to move us a little away from the paranoid stance on the mismeasure of man. Another aspect of 19th century science or physiognomy is the measuring of affect, facial expression, emotions, which seems integral to this facial measuring science. And I know, as a psychiatrist, that there's a lot of work on using all the kinds of biometrics to detect when somebody is paranoid or depressed, mostly, that you could be looking at somebody's face with your camera, at your phone, and say, like, oh, you're looking down. Maybe you need to talk to somebody. And that's part of the same kind of research that I think is being done.
I recently visited his website. It's a German website where in Berlin there's an institute that will train you exactly to do this, and it has what's the term that I'm looking for? Lavaters type of, and phrenology written all over it. I think, gosh, I mean, it is drawing from similar toolkits. I think what is helpful to just point out in this realm is that we're very easily will dismiss this as pseudoscience, which is a term that I think many of you are familiar with, that I try to stay away from, because pseudoscience indicates it's more of a political term than it is a neutral term, because it allows us to say this is bad science, this is good science. And we can agree that this particular phrenology, revival of phrenology in Germany, could be indicated as bad science. But what you'll see is that the toolkits that develops these sciences are very much part of what we still do today in supposedly legitimate forms of science, right? So you could say, oh, Carl Pearson is a pseudoscientist for what he's doing, but his principal component analysis methods are running older versions of facial recognition technology to this day. So this term pseudoscience is kind of complicated because it allows us to ignore historical connections that are actually really important. And so it's also a term that the physical anthropologists use to distinguish themselves from the phrenology of the late 19th century, saying, no, what we're doing is legitimate science, that is pseudoscience. So it's the same toolkits that seem to be applying in different realms, and some of it we consider good science, and some of it we consider bad science, but we really need history to kind of show where they are all connected and why they're tied and what the implications are of that.
Yeah, maybe just to kind of expand on that a little bit. There's this line of argument that if we didn't have phrenology, which were the bumps on the head, we wouldn't have brain localization theory, right? If we didn't have physiognomy, which is the relationship of features to character traits, then maybe we wouldn't know another set of things. If we didn't have pathognomy, which is the notion of emotion and its relationship, then maybe there's another set of things we wouldn't know. Speaking specifically to this kind of idea of training, maybe like building on Ekman and these ideas of microexpressions, and maybe we can understand what's going on with people in their faces. And on some level, I was advocating that with the notion of intimacy and the face-to-face. I will once again remind us that a lot of these systems are being trained in the same way. So a lot of these chatbots that are supposed to diagnose people because they are trained on things like the same algorithm that trains Twitter, within an hour devolves into the most grotesque versions of anti-Semitism and racism that you could possibly imagine. So I think it's not impossible that there are versions of these that could produce valuable interactions, but at the moment, the trading databases seem to excavate the worst instincts of many people, which an hour on Twitter will also do.
Thank you. Yeah. So for our final question, we go to up on the stairs. Yeah.
In the museum here, I looked at the pictures, the side profile, not the front. You're talking about biometrics, and I noticed you started the program with biometrics, like you measure the eyes. When you look at a face on, it's possible to have two people that look pretty close, but if you look at the side, especially the nose and the nostril, that could be a key ID. How can a computer identify for sure it's me if they don't look at the side too? In other words, you need to have several different pictures of someone rather than the front. Could you, in other words, the principal components analysis needs to cover more of your face than just the front.
Yeah, that feels like it should, but actually what a lot of the face recognition technology does is it essentially just turns your face into a series of data points. And the reason it's gotten more effective over time is twofold. Number one, the technology has gotten a lot more granular, so it can measure very, very small distances as data points, and so it doesn't actually need a whole lot of information to get a unique set of data points that are unique to you, but that only matters if it has those images stored by which to compare. So if it has a rich array of stored faces that it can confidently feel is you in the database, which it essentially does now, then it probably only needs one kind of comparison image from which to work. But this is relatively new, and one of the things that is very interesting to plastic surgeons, for example, is whether or not plastic surgery can befuddle the face recognition technology. And you might imagine that the answer to that would be an unequivocal yes, and it turns out it's largely a no, partly because of the reason you're gesturing toward, which is that in order for it to fundamentally alter the distance between all the data points at your face, it actually has to redraw the bones and underlying musculature of your face. So if you get, for example, a nose job, which is the most common facial cosmetic surgery, or your eyes done, and the face recognition is capturing an image of your cheek, it will still be able to be very accurate. So it's brow surgery and chin surgery that change the whole relationship of your face, most largely found in gender confirmation surgery.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Ken, Sharrona, Iris.
Yeah.
This was a really wonderful conversation. I learned a lot, and Soraya, thank you so much for co-moderating with me.
Thank you for your questions.